and welcome to episode 453 of Retro Encounter, RPG fans bi-weekly, I'm getting it, podcast of many topics. I'm Zach Wilkerson, and I am your host today. And today we are here to talk about Hironobu Sakaguchi. I'll get into everything that means, but we're going to be looking at his his history as a creator, his themes, his collaborators, sort of where he's been, where he is, and where maybe he's going in the future. But before we get into talking about Sakaguchi, let's introduce the panelists, starting with you, Aleks Franiczek.
Hello.
And making his Retro Encounter, I believe, podcast debut, Matt Wardell.
Hey, happy to be here.
Awesome. Happy to have you, Matt, and happy to have you, of course, Aleks. And I'm really excited to chat with both of you about this, about what we're talking about today. So, as I said earlier, we're going to be talking about Hironobu Sakaguchi, and it sort of was inspired by a couple of different things, the idea of this conversation. First of all, we just played Final Fantasy IX for the podcast, and Final Fantasy IX is in many ways sort of like a tipping point in Sakaguchi's career for a lot of different reasons that we'll talk about. But it's also sort of like the highlight of what he's about in a lot of ways. But also, there's been an idea sort of floating around that Aleks came up with for a long time, sort of called Auteur Encounter, where we look at like major creators in sort of the RPG space, people who exert a lot of influence over the games that that they're working on. And if you're not familiar with the term auteur, it actually it technically originates from an American film critic named Andrew Sarris, but the idea kind of comes from a film critic from the 1940s named Andre Bazin. And basically the idea is that like in filmmaking, the most interesting thing is to look at the director. Like they are sort of the major creative force, the major creative control over it. It's a theory that still dominates a lot of film criticism. I was a film major in college. It dominates a lot of film criticism, but a lot of people have criticized it. And actually that will come up today in our conversations. Pauline Kael, who was a very famous film critic, criticized it a lot. And, the idea that directors aren't the only people who get to have a say. And probably the person who is most frequently considered an auteur in the video game space is not in our coverage. That's Hideo Kojima. But I'd also say that someone like Yoko Taro, I think, would also qualify under that. But Hironobu Sakaguchi is probably, at least in America, I think, the most major figure, the most well-known figure in a lot of ways for Japanese RPGs. For sort of what he's created, what he's done, sort of the legacy that he has left. But he's not, he's not a singular voice. He's not a singular vision. And we'll be talking about that and whether we really think that we should consider him to be a singular voice or someone who maybe knows how to bring in lots of voices. So that's a whole lot of English lecturing for me. I will stop now. But I want to kind of take a step back before we dig into Sakaguchi and talk about our experiences with Hironobu Sakaguchi, his games, sort of like, what we've played in general, but like where we started and maybe like sort of our overall thoughts, but we don't want to go too in depth because we're going to be kind of digging in and looking at sort of his game output sort of chronologically and talking about sort of how he develops and changes and moves over the course of his career. So starting with you, Aleks, sort of what's your history with Sakaguchi's games and your overall thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure I've talked about this on the podcast to some capacity, but my love of video games did really develop with the Final Fantasy series and RPGs on the Super Nintendo in particular. Watching my older brothers playing them even before I started playing them, I was just like really fascinated by the ways they could like tell stories just using like little sprites and things like that, little just cute animations, but that managed to like convey something more like expressive out of that. And so that's a big part of what made Final Fantasy so impactful to me and made me get into playing video games and loving video games in the first place is how games like Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI would have these like nuanced characters behind like these little sprite representations and were like especially like cinematic for games at that time in particular. The ways they would try to represent emotions and cutscenes, the ways they would use music to support that, and obviously Nobuo Uematsu is someone who's going to be coming into this conversation a lot, I imagine. And just also the ways that those two games in particular tried to like merge story and gameplay at the same time, like using like boss battles and things like that to communicate like character development and dramatic story moments. Really made an impact on me, and I just saw like this fairly primitive medium at the time as like something that had a lot of potential for that reason. So a big part of that is because of Sakaguchi's huge ambitions, I think, going into this medium. And so, yeah, his work has had an incredible impact on me.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll save my story, but it's very similar to yours for a little while from now. But Matt, what's your experience with Sakaguchi?
Yeah, so I started playing games on like my dad's NES, right, on the Famicom, and he had games like Ultima, which I wasn't really into, or I didn't really grasp the idea of like turn-based battles or like RPG systems. It wasn't until later in the PS2 I had like an older friend who was kind of like a big brother figure to me. He actually gave me Final Fantasy X and he's like, "Hey, I think you're going to like this." And I'm like, "What is this like anime?" Like I was a little bit creeped out by it at first to be honest, right, which is ironic considering where I live now. But
For the
he
record, Matt is our only person on staff who lives in Japan now. Just want the listeners to know that.
Yeah, and I love Western RPGs. But yeah, so I played 10 and I fell in love with it. Like it had the scope and scale that I've never seen in a game before, like the length as well, which I know was a big thing that Sakaguchi wanted was to have like a extended experience, right? Not just a 10-hour thing. And then after that, after 10, I went back and I think honestly the next Final Fantasy I got into was 3 on the DS, like the remake. And so to me, like Final Fantasy 3 and Final Fantasy 4 are like the quintessential FF experiences, like the DS remakes. But since then I've gone back and I've played through I think every single one of them except for 2, which I just started for the first time. But yeah, just I think the size, the scale, and the music too, like Alex mentioned, like that's to me that's the defining trait of a JRPG is like a great soundtrack.
Yeah, and I can't disagree. Like I think for me, like the older I get, the more I realize how much music has an impact on me. Like I was rewatching The Godfather the other day, and I was like, man, the music in this movie is so good. Like it's so like the feelings are evoked by that more than anything. But
Mhm.
yeah, in terms of like my experience with Sakaguchi, like I go back not quite to the beginning, which we'll talk about, but my people who listen to this podcast regularly know that my grandparents were into RPGs, and that we'd played Dragon Warrior, and then Final Fantasy was the first one that I remember, like the original OG Final Fantasy was the first one I remember really being accessible enough for me. Like it's sort of like I was able to play the Dragon Quest games, but like they were harder in a lot of ways and a little bit more opaque in terms of progression.
Mm,
Whereas Final Fantasy felt a little more accessible to me as a very young person playing it. I was 5, 6 years old, and just like the scope of it, like there are so many moments in Final Fantasy One that are so epic to me in my memory. And so it kind of just goes from there. Like Final Fantasy IV was the first one that I remember really understanding like what it's doing, and like sort of the scope of it and the story of it just like was mesmerizing to me as a child. The story is now just like so generic anime tropey, but I still love it. And just like sort of watching his progression. And so like Sakaguchi was the first like game creator's name who I knew. Like this was a person who like knew what he was doing.
mm,
And I follow him through that. I play all the way up through Final Fantasy 9, and I'm not following the media well enough to know that he leaves sort of around 10, but after 10 it's complicated. And I didn't play a lot of Mistwalker stuff until recently, but like it's interesting to watch sort of what he has sort of maintained and what he has left behind, and sort of like what's him. I think that the more you play of a Sakaguchi game, the more you can sort of get a feel for like, okay, this is like sort of him. But also the reality is, and we'll talk about this, like he is so influenced by what comes before. We'll talk about how Dragon Quest influences it. He's just like a really fascinating figure to look at as a creator, and it's sort of like singular in the game space, especially if you look at how he's running Mistwalker and has run Mistwalker.
mm.
So I want to kind of start at the beginning. I don't want to get into Final Fantasy quite yet, because those of you who don't know, I think that this is a little bit of a history lesson. Those of you who aren't aware, and for the record, and I went, and this is true for the panelists, and this is true for everybody who's listening. We have all done. We talked about this before recording, like a lot of research here. But the reality is, like, there are so many stories surrounding Final Fantasy in particular, and like some of them are like semi-apocryphal. And Sakaguchi contradicts himself sometimes. So like I am certain we will get a well actually email. And that's totally fine. I welcome that, but know that we all are doing our best to talk about sort of our understanding of it. Because it's sometimes it's unclear too, like how much was Sakaguchi involved, how much was he not. But sort of the beginning of Sakaguchi is he's in university. Apparently, he doesn't really like video games early in his career, like early in his life. Like it's not like a thing that he's interested in. But getting to Matt's point, eventually he plays Ultima, and obviously he was older than me and or Matt, because the first time I played Ultima, I just kept trying to steal from like the shopkeepers. And I was like, why do I keep dying? Like, oh, because I keep doing stupid things. So he plays Ultima and he realizes that he really loves that. And so, how much that influenced his decision to join Square at the time, who was a very fledgling company. They weren't, they had done almost nothing of note. Um, and then he goes on to work on some action games that he's not super crazy about. But then Dragon Quest comes out. And when Dragon Quest comes out, it allows him to sort of convince the people who work at Square, like, hey, RPGs are a viable thing in this space. Like there's something that we can do. There's something we can sort of do and play around with. And so he creates and he sort of directs Final Fantasy with a relatively small team, obviously driven in many ways by Ultima and of course Dragon Quest. And he, is not, he's the director, he's not necessarily the writer. There's a lot of different people who are involved at this point, but there's a lot going on here. And during the NES era, like it sort of steadily builds, and he realizes that like this is something that he wants to do in a more long-term way. And so Final Fantasy 1 through 3, I think have a lot going for them, and I'll sort of share some of my thoughts on 1, 2, and 3 as we go here. But we'll sort of start with Final Fantasy 1, and I think both of you have played it. Sort of what sticks out to you guys about Final Fantasy 1 in terms of its design, in terms of its approach?
Yeah, so you talk about the comparison and the inspiration. Obviously, he felt from Dragon Quest, and um, based on like what I was reading about, reading some interviews with him, and just from my own experiences with the game, like it seems like he needed like a way to separate this series from Dragon Quest and make it stand out. And a big way that they did end up doing that was through just presenting kind of more cutting edge graphics and introducing more like complex storytelling into the mix. Because I mean, if you look at Final Fantasy's plot like synopsis in comparison to that of Dragon Quest 1 or even Dragon Quest 2, it is so much more convoluted. There's way many more twists. There's way
There's
more
time
lore.
loops.
Yeah, it's like it's so dense for anything else that was trying to be told in a video game around that time. Which is just like, yeah, like if Dragon Quest was about like tradition and like simplicity, like Sakaguchi tried to ensure that FF stood out just through like technical and story like maximalism. And obviously that made a huge impact on the Western market, especially as they started developing more technology to flesh out those elements even further. But a cool little anecdote around the original Final Fantasy is the role of the programmer, who's actually an Iranian American named Nazir Gibeli, who had like a reputation already before working on Final Fantasy as like a programming prodigy in like the 80s, making like these groundbreaking 3D shooters. But he never worked on an RPG before. But somehow they got in touch with him and got him on board for this Japanese project. And Sakaguchi was like walking him through what an RPG was, how it had to function, and how he wanted everything to look, to sort of compete with Dragon Quest and have like a more distinct and impressive presentation. And a lot of the things in the reception of Final Fantasy One was had to do with like the technology, the fact that like you didn't have that first person view of Dragon Quest. You saw your characters sort of on the side of the screen, and you would select attacks for them, and then you'd watch them do cool things. Like that was a big part of the appeal. Like you select an attack, and then you see the character do something. It was way more cinematic. and
Mm.
also the introduction of like different vehicles was huge. Like I'm pretty sure Dragon Quest 2 already had a boat, but with Final Fantasy 1 you had a canoe, you had the boat, and you had like an airship that like just tore across the sky. And apparently that in particular, like the airship and the feel of it and the speed of it, made a huge impression on players and was like a big part of making FF stand out on release. So that's was really cool to read about.
Mm.
It's fascinating you talk about the first person thing because I remember when I was previewing Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D remake, like one of the number one complaints that like our readers had, like on like the YouTube video we put out or whatever, were like, why is it still first person view? I want to be able to see the actions. And so it's interesting that they make that innovation at the time, and it's still something that people think about today.
Mhm.
Yeah, Alex hit it on the head with like the being able to see your sprites for the first time, and I think like in general, the style of Final Fantasy, it separates itself from Dragon Quest in that it's not just your typical like sword and magic, fantasy RPG. Like it kind of moves beyond the D&Dification of it, I guess, and it's more Shakespearean to me, right? Like everything about it feels operatic and like they're willing to bend the genre into more like steampunk elements, like you said with the airship, and then later on with like science fiction elements. But yeah, sticking with one, it just distinguished itself as being a little more like serious to me too. Like it is cutesy compared to what it looks like now, like the little black mage sprite, but like just in general, Final Fantasy like doesn't aim to please with cuteness. You know what I mean? It
Mhm.
is skewing a little more serious. I feel like, and you really get that more in Final Fantasy 2. But just from the get go, it feels like whoa, this is like going to be an epic adventure, like, and not just epic, but episodic in a way where it's like, yeah,
Hmm.
try sitting down and describing the plot of any Final Fantasy game, and you're going to be yapping for like 20 minutes, right, to the person, which is unlike other games of the time, right, where it's like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
Ninja Gaiden, he goes to save the girl, right? But this is pretty, I don't know, epic in scale and in like ambition.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about that. I mean, it's one of the things that Sakaguchi talks about too. Like he talks about like the sort of this desire to make dramatic narratives, and while he is not super involved in, I think, especially in the first three, like the narrative storytelling of it, he certainly is pushing towards that, and you see it more in two, as we'll talk about in the second year. But he, like you sort of see like it's funny because Chaos is certainly the first like ass pull villain of of the series, which is something that they love to do, all the way up through nine, as I remembered very recently. And so yeah, like you see so many pieces of it, like the idea of crystals, the idea of the elemental. Like he's so
Mm,
interested in like these very like sort of baseline concepts, and that's something that's not just Final Fantasy. It's something that Sakaguchi sort of continues after he leaves Squaresoft. It's always interesting to me to see like what continues after he leaves, especially when he's writing something. And so yeah, but like I think it's really interesting. And then I think when you go on to like something like two, which like Dragon Quest is a failure, I think, in most people's eyes, but it is a press, right? Like it's a press towards more narrative storytelling. It might be like Star Wars but bad, but it's still like Star Wars, right? Um, so many stories are Star Wars but bad. Have you guys ever read Aragon, that really crappy YA fantasy
hey,
book
hey,
written
Oh
hey.
by?
yeah, it
Take
was
take it easy,
huge
Zach.
when I was a kid. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say
I'm
you
I'm
guys are
of the
probably both
age.
younger than
I'm of
I
the
am. So
age.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I was a teenager when it came out, and I was like, "What is this crap?" And I still think that. But
Oh,
anyway, the point is, like, it's been like Final Fantasy 12 is Star Wars, but not as good. But
okay.
it's just interesting to see the progression into the storytelling, but also like the experimentation with the battle system that obviously Kawatsu, who goes on to run Saga still to this day, is heavily involved with.
Yeah, and yeah, 2 obviously was a huge step, like, in terms of, like, ambitious storytelling. I even, like, read that, apparently in this case, as opposed to 1, like, the story was actually planned first, and the gameplay systems were made to be, like, built around that. I guess that was, like, the developer's way of, like, baking in an emphasis on story in, like, the development process, and maybe that's why the the game design is so out of whack in this game. But it's a cool idea nonetheless. And for all of this game's faults, it has like it introduced a lot of like the staples that we now associate with Final Fantasy, and that they were like able to like iterate with 4 especially, and then just building and building and building upon that from there. But like obviously the story around like a group of rebels tackling like an evil empire is very Star Wars. But the fact that on top of like the main cast, which is sort of these kids who are out of their element but want to get revenge on the empire that like destroyed their town by joining like a rebel army. They're kind of shallow as characters. There isn't too much writing to them, but you get a lot of these guest characters throughout the game as well, which sort of have their own arcs, like characters like Minwu, Joseph,
Mm.
Richard, the first dragoon of the series. They all have these distinct arcs within the game that usually end with them having to sacrifice themselves in some super melodramatic way. And the overall tone of this game is just so so much drama. Like none of the whimsy that's in the later games like is apparent here at all. Like they were going for serious drama, and with the limitations of the NES, like it didn't really pay off. But man, was it like impressive for the time. Like I mean, this game begins with the first like unwinnable battle in an RPG, which has become such a trope,
Yeah.
meant to show like how like the characters aren't strong enough to face this force yet. But later in the game, you get to face these enemies again, and you destroy them, and there's a lot of both gameplay and narrative payoff there. So yeah, this combination of like rebellion, the fact that there's like betrayals and sacrifice and romance, like these are all like staples of this series that were established here. So not the best game to play, but a very cool one to think about nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, playing the Pixel remaster of 2 for the first time very recently this week, I was shocked at, like, yeah, just the opening, it feels so cinematic. I'm like, "This is from the Famicom? Like, holy cow." And, yeah, the unwinnable battle, like, getting your butt kicked by the Black Knights or whatever, and then, like you said, Alex, I was kind of shocked by the melodrama and lack of, whimsy, like you said. Right off the bat, I think in the first town, the first quest that you really have, you go to meet Prince Scott. I was playing it in a different language, so I'm not sure. I think Prince Scott, his name was. And he tells you, he's laying in bed and he tells you, "Oh, tell the queen that I love her." Oh, never mind. And then he dies and gives you his
Yeah.
ring. And it's just like it's so melodramatic. And then like there's no like mourning of his death. It's just like da 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 da. You got a ring, right? And I'm like, wow, that was weird, like tonally. But you could tell that he was going for something epic, right? Something Shakespearean, like I said, and just the idea that all your characters are set, like they have stories, like it's not just a class that is interchangeable, black mage, white mage. Now you actually have characters like Minwoo who are like, okay, he's the white mage character. You can build them up in other ways with the saga, weapon leveling system, but there's a clear path of like, okay, this is meant to be aesthetically your healer, and this should be your black mage, and so on. Yeah, I thought that was really you can tell like even if it's a bit of a misswing, you can tell that they took a big swing, and I think we wouldn't have Final Fantasy today if not for 2 and like the
Yeah.
swings that it took.
Yeah, I mean, like to me, I think that like especially 2 and 3 in particular, swings, like big swings are like sort of what define those games in my head. So like obviously like if you go read interviews from Sakaguchi, even like post Final Fantasy 2, they recognize that like they didn't have enough time to they didn't play test it essentially. They didn't have enough time to perfect that battle system, which Koatsu sort of has taken and made, made into a whole epic franchise, which gets to one of the things that Sakaguchi is good at, right? Like he recognized a talent in Koatsu, and Koatsu wasn't ready, but he got ready, and then he goes on to make Final Fantasy Legend in this country, which I think is just called Saga in Japan, and then he goes on to make the Saga series. But big swings, I think, is sort of, and if you read interviews with Sakaguchi, one of the things that he consistently talks about is big swings. And we actually have a feature on the website about like how Final Fantasy is about the concept of reinvention. People argue all the time about like what is Final Fantasy enough, and it's an exhausting conversation to me. But reinvention, I think, is definitely something that happens here, and but it also like is sort of bouncing off of what's happening at the time to the point to where like I think like nowadays, like something like Final Fantasy 3. would be considered just like a straight up ripoff of Dragon Quest 3, right? Like, oh, you had a class system, now we're gonna have a class system. But like it was like he and Hori were like playing off of each other. They were learning, they were growing from each other and pushing forward with it. And 3 has some serious missteps with the class system, there's like one dungeon where you have to use all Dark Knights the whole way through. Like there are so many things about it that are just like so gimmicky. I think you have like I don't even think I'm exaggerating with this number, like 7 different airships with 7 different sets of abilities to go different places. It's like absurd. But it's like so cool to see these creators in, Sakaguchi in particular, but like, his team working through like how can we play around with the genre, and some of it hits and some of it does not hit.
Mm.
And 2, I think definitely because that's like the battle system doesn't hit, like that kind of sucks. But like 3, it's like some of like the gimmicks are on the sides and it's like annoying, but like it's not game breaking. So I think 3 is fascinating on that front too.
Yeah, I do think 3 is a step back in terms of storytelling, to be honest. Um, but one more thing, like going back, the difference between 1, 2, and 3 is I was listening to an interview between Uematsu, Kitase, and Sakaguchi, and Uematsu said that actually Sakaguchi was not overbearing, but he was like really involved and like looking over the shoulder of everyone. And in Uematsu's case, he was actually dictating to him like, no, this is what the music should sound like here and here for Final Fantasy 1 and 2. And apparently, it wasn't until Final Fantasy 3 that he kind of let his team run freely.
Mm.
Like he kind of built that trust with them, and he let them go wild from that point
And
on.
3 is the first really truly great Final Fantasy soundtrack in my opinion.
Oh
Yeah,
Eternal Wind.
yeah,
yeah.
Ooh,
yeah.
Oh
ooh.
boy.
But yeah, like you said, Matt, the story is definitely a downgrade, going from 2 to 3. But one thing that I do think 3 also contributed on like a narrative front that's really valuable to the series is like more of these like distinct events that are like they're not contextualized in the story well, but like they're memorable like set pieces nonetheless. And this is like one of the things that I
Mhm.
think this series does really well, and I think like it's a big driving force of Sakaguchi's role as a project head is to like try to like bake gameplay into the storytelling and like try to create these like memorable set pieces that stick out visually, that stick out with like the specific music that's tied to them, and then just like with that combination of those things just like have like an impact on the player in like a way that like Dragon Quest, which was still very much at this time dealing with like pretty samey looking towns, like cave dungeons, tower dungeons, um, didn't really get yet. And Final Fantasy 3, despite having a pretty uninteresting plot and characters, like ran even further with 2, like with kind of like greater NES technology towards that end. So that's another thing that I think it really contributed to the series going forward. But also just like the fact that like the jobs were able to distinguish themselves so much from D&D archetypes is another important part
Mm.
of this game, and like a lot of that I feel is tied to like the character designs of Amano, and just like you were saying, Matt, like this more like serious tone that Final Fantasy manages in comparison to Dragon Quest, a lot of that is tied to the work of Amano and Uematsu, especially if you compare it to Dragon Quest's like use of Sugiyama with the very like classical kind of sounding music, and then Toriyama's very anime sort of joyful, cheerful art. Final Fantasy with those two artists, both on like the visual and audio front, like we're going for a more like self-consciously serious, almost like artistic style. And I feel like that's reflected a lot in these very very creative, unique looking designs for the different job classes in 3.
Yeah, I mean, Amano is such a like key to the identity of Final Fantasy for me. Like they do have cutesy characters like Chocobo and Mog and everything like that, but just in general, like it does have this kind of elegance to it. I guess and like this theatricality to it. To the point where like honestly here in Japan, like you very rarely see any Final Fantasy merchandise, or like you don't see that much iconography from it. Whereas Dragon Quest is like really leaning into the cuteness and like the bombastic music. Like I can't go a day without hearing Dragon Quest music on TV, like in a beer commercial or something,
That's
right?
fascinating to
Yeah.
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, and you never
And
hear
also
Final
awesome.
Fantasy.
Super
It
awesome.
is awesome. I'm like, what the is this like related, like a crossover? And like, nope, there's not even like acknowledgement that it's Dragon Quest, but it's like the Dragon Quest theme. Whereas Final Fantasy, like it feels more niche, which is funny because it's bigger in the West. I'm not sure what like hit harder in the West than it did here. I mean, it's certainly popular, but I'm always kind of curious, like why did it take off, whereas Dragon Quest didn't, as much in the West. But
I think I might have some ideas as to an answer to that question, but I want to point out one more thing about Final Fantasy III that like is an idea that sort of gets pulled forward. Because you're right, like the storytelling in Final Fantasy III, I actually think that like the storytelling in Final Fantasy III, while it's a step back from two, is still like kind of decent, for the time.
yeah,
You got some decent characters, some very like sort of town-based storytelling. I think the stuff with Zandy is sort of interesting, and I think Zandy is sort of like a proto main villain for Final Fantasy going forward. Like I think Golbez reminds me of Zandy. Certainly Kuja does.
Mm.
And so like I think that there's still things there that are interesting. And again, Cloud of Darkness is like a I don't know, something that Zandy summons as like something that he is, upset about. It's very Final Fantasy 9 as well. But like because when I went to go, I actually reviewed it when the Pixel remaster came out, and I remember always sort of thinking like, hey, people have said the storytelling in this game isn't very good. I still feel like it's still super melodramatic, and I think it still works on that front. But I think that also is why in the West, it's sort of more immediately accessible. Whereas Dragon Quest a lot of times is like sort of like very town-based storytelling, especially as it starts to find its feet right around this time as well. It's very town-based storytelling, whereas Final Fantasy in general, which in the next entry, which sort of becomes like sort of like when Final Fantasy sort of really finds its feet, and I think Sakaguchi as a creator really finds his feet, is Final Fantasy IV. And I certainly think that like the visual presentation of Final Fantasy IV is a huge step up. And it's funny now you go even look at like it compared to Final Fantasy VI on the same console, and it's like they don't they, they don't seem like they're the same console. But like that mode 7, like the very opening, you guys,
oh yeah,
I'm gonna age myself here, but like you guys aren't old enough to realize how amazing it was when we saw like the airships flying in that mode 7. And it was so dramatic, and like
Mm.
Cecil was so cool as a character. And I think that it's I think that Final Fantasy a lot of times deals in these like very sort of like binary oppositions, and I think Sakaguchi continues that after he leaves Final Fantasy. These very binary oppositions that are very easy to sort of like attach yourself to. You think about like Cecil's the Dark Knight trying to cleanse his sins to become the Paladin. You think about like a long lost brother. Like there are all these like huge anime tropes that like are established by lots of people who are not Sakaguchi, but he pulls them into these great melodrama. And no matter how much Final Fantasy IV story is absurd now, I still have such a soft spot for it. And I really think it is, even though Dragon Quest IV comes out right before this, it has an okay story. I think Dragon Quest IV story is okay. But Final Fantasy IV is like this huge melodramatic thing that allows us to attach ourselves to characters and named characters in a way that Dragon Quest never really tried to. And it feels like something that is more immediately accessible to people.
so yeah, I mean, Final Fantasy 3 and 1, you don't have like a named character. Like you're just like the Onion Knights in Final Fantasy 3, and you have the same four characters the entire time, I believe. Whereas Final Fantasy 4, like the thing that shocked me playing it the first time, was like these characters come and go. It's in like a very cinematic way, where it's like Kane is dipping in and out, just like as he sees fit. And characters die, they sacrifice themselves, they go off on their own tangents or journeys during it. And to me, that was really shocking, and just like the unreliability of the party. I'm like, oh god, like, do I give my best accessories to this guy? He's gonna dip again, right? And also just the unreliability of Cecil as like the protagonist of like in the beginning, obviously it's like you're the Dark Knight, you're this commander of like the Red Wings, and it's like, am I the bad guy? Which I mean, it's made very clear very quickly with like the town of, what is it, Mist or something, where you blow it up. But right off the
Yeah,
bat,
Mistia and Mist actually. Yeah,
yeah, too,
well,
yeah.
both up basically. Yeah.
And like as a kid playing that, I was like, "Whoa, wait a second! Like, why am I playing as the bad guy?" Like that was like revolutionary from like a storytelling standpoint, you know. And it is a bit melodramatic. Like in the DS version, there's the infamous like, "Why?" Like when he
Oh
blows up.
yeah, the voice acting in
I
that
mean,
version's
I
so
say
bad.
why every time I play it
Yeah.
because like that game is like the most difficult RPG I think I've ever played.
Oh my god. But and one more thing about like the opening of FF4 is it's the first game that like takes the prelude into like the prelude song into a new direction. So in the first three, you have like the do 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 like harp, and in this one, after like half a minute, it kicks into this like flute melody, and like playing that for the first time, I was like, whoa, like this is like a step up, like this is beautiful, you know. It just felt like a step forward in every aspect, I think.
I actually never knew that was the sort of entry point of the second part of the prelude. That's cool.
Mm.
But yeah, I feel like in terms of like the if like the first three games were going for like theatricality, FF4 like actually knew what it was doing in terms of executing that vision by having like a dramatic redemption arc about its main character. And like another thing I know they wanted to do with this game was to even further bake in like storytelling into like both dungeons and like boss fights especially. And you see that all throughout this game, like things like saving Rosa in the Tower of Zot like sort of provides like you some like more narrative motivation through that sequence. And apparently
Uh,
there
uh,
was
uh, it was apparently supposed to be timed originally, right?
exactly, yeah, that
Whoa.
but apparently the vision of like seeing Rosa actually get crushed was just deemed too gruesome, so they decided not to go for it.
Thank
But
God.
yeah, but yeah, there's also like the boss fights, like just the use of like the ATB, which was designed by Hiroyuki Ito, who would be the combat designer on a lot of the games going forward. Helped create like drama in the combat and make it like more cinematic and narratively satisfying. Like the first boss, the mist dragon, like you have to like when it fades into mist, you have to like wait until it like comes out, and like time is baked into like how you're experiencing these kinds of fights. Same with like the demon wall, which has like it's slowly closing in on you, and you have to like beat it within a time limit.
Mm.
So yeah, like FF4 in terms of like taking the games further in that sense, in terms of like even better combining those two elements, that seems to be like the core design philosophy of the series at this point, like really made some significant steps forward.
Yeah. And I think it's important too before we move on. Like, there's a guy named Takashi Tokita, if I'm not mistaken, that's how you pronounce it.
Hmm.
Who goes on, who is the designer and the writer here. And again, like Sakaguchi, again, like how much Sakaguchi is involved in these stories is sometimes difficult to suss out, no matter how many interviews you read or whatever. Like, how much did he exert his influence over these stories? But like, you see him for years sort of consistently saying like, I want drama in my stories, I want narrative in my stories, even if you're looking at interviews pre Final Fantasy IV. But he has to pick the right person to do it. And I think that one of the themes that we're going to be touching on here is like, this is a dude who knew how to pick the right guy. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And I hate to say guy,
Mm.
but that's the truth. Unfortunately, if you look down the list, he knew how to pick the right person for it. And Takeda goes on, if I'm not mistaken, to work on Live Alive. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can see some of that sort of working in here. And like, this is a person who, and Live Alive has very melodramatic storytelling at times too, which I think is really fun. But it's not just Uematsu who he sort of inherits, or Kawatsu who like is very early in his career. It's just like a person who he pulls in when it's already a little developed, and they go on to like go do excellent work, and they sort of develop ATB, which is like it's such a part of Final Fantasy at this point that even like there's an element of it in the remake trilogy, right? Like it's still here. It's just fascinating to think about
Mm.
like how Sakaguchi's choices back then influence the games we still play in 2025.
I will say for like the all male development team, there is like the notable exception of Kazuko Shibuya, who did all of the almost all of the pixel art for everything from Final Fantasy 2 onwards, through like the first like 6 games. And she doesn't like pop up that much in like Western interviews or anything like that. Like she's very like closed off into Japan, I guess, but she's still like active in art creation. But when it comes to like, for example, on Famitsu, right, like their YouTube channel and everything, she appears for like every single anniversary thing with Sakaguchi and with Kitase. And she's like, I was just watching the other day on Famitsu's YouTube page. There's like a 50 something hour series of videos where it's Shibuya and Sakaguchi playing through Final Fantasy VI, and like it's really like awesome to see. And like I don't know, yeah, I wish that she would have more exposure in the West because she does do a lot of like interviews in Japan only, which is a shame that like she's. I feel like even with like her and Amano, like they are both responsible for like a lot of Final Fantasy's identity or like the aesthetic value of it.
Yeah, and this is just like an important like point to emphasize in general as we're doing like a sort of author or auteur encounter. Is that like Sakaguchi was involved, it seems, in like the story of pretty much every Final Fantasy, but he wasn't actually like very hands-on with the series after 2 or 3. From that point on, he sort of just took on more of a director role and a producer role, and sort of was just overseeing the work of different people on the project. Apparently, he was like pretty strict based on like the interviews I've read, like that he would like you were describing, Zach, like he would be over people's shoulders and he'd be like, I don't really like this. Like I actually want like this is sort of my vision. So like, can you make it more like this? And he was like very sort of open about like just swaying down ideas and like trying to push people more towards like getting what he wanted. But he was clearly very good at it with like the amount of talent he cultivated and like the amount of talent that would then go on to create and lead their own projects like Tokita, like Kawazu. So yeah, I mean like as a just like a supervisor, like a person with a vision who could drive a team, clearly he was onto something.
And that becomes even more important, right, with the next one, where he brings on Katase, who is still sort of a major figure in the Final Fantasy world, much more and for a much longer time, interestingly, than Sakaguchi ever was. But I think Final Fantasy V is interesting because obviously, guessing most of you who are listening, like it sort of it again, sort of like Final Fantasy 3, it pulls back on the narrative, but it kind of enhances the gameplay to a degree that like many people think that Final Fantasy V is like the best gameplay experience in Final Fantasy. I'm not sure I would agree with that, but that's a thought. But like, I think that like you can sort of see them like, okay, like we tried this before, let's do it better this time. Final Fantasy II's narrative was like interesting but messy. Let's do it again. Here's Final Fantasy IV. Same thing with 3. Like three's job system was gimmicky and okay. Like really, there were 2 jobs that were busted, and everything else kind of sucked, except for when we made you use it, like a party of all dragoons or a party of all dark knights. Let's fix that, and let's do something really interesting with it in Final Fantasy V. And so I think it's always really fascinating to watch. And I think Sakaguchi could probably take credit for this, like the way that he wants to push things forward, but he also wants to correct and use what has come before to make it stronger.
Yeah, I mean, comparing him to like other video game auteurs, like you said, like Kojima or Yoko Taro, it's like he doesn't have as much of Sakaguchi doesn't have as much of a individual like oddball identity that like marks him from others, but like he definitely has his ear to the ground. Like he's like paying attention to what other developers are doing and reacting to it, right? Like in a competitive way, I think.
Yeah, and like apart from like just the fact that like 4 is like the big innovation in storytelling, and then 5 is like another big innovation in gameplay and the job systems. Like both of them also just do a lot better on the other front. Like 4 did a great job balancing its dungeons and boss fights around the particular party you would have at that time, and like making every character feel unique with the kind of class that that character pertains to. And then 5 just like its story isn't like incredible, but like these are some fun characters, and like the
Mhm.
especially playing the Pixel remaster, like the writing in this game is just fun in general. And
Yeah.
like with Kitase being like now like the lead script writer, I feel like a lot of that idiosyncratic mix of like whimsy and melodrama like kind of begins with him, because we see that at play here with the way these characters are written to be like goofy but also be able to have like these ultra dramatic moments, and for that to somehow feel natural and just be like a lot of fun and interesting at the same time.
And taking it back for a moment to like Miss Shibuya, the like pixel art designer, I think it wasn't until Final Fantasy 6, maybe 5, I think it's 6, that you could actually see like the character sprites matched between the battle screen and the overworld screen. So I think like from that point onward, or around this era, the characters were showing a lot more emotion, like closing their eyes, nodding, spinning around, and it looked more connected to what you were fighting with, right? So I don't know, it was easier to connect with the characters in that way. But I am curious, do either of you know why Final Fantasy V was skipped over in releasing in the West? Like, why did they go from 4 to 6? Were they just aiming for this kind of these cinematic games more? Like, I don't really know the reason for that.
I believe it's because so Final Fantasy 4 when it's localized to Final Fantasy 2 in the West was made like way easier, and there just seemed to be like an idea of that Japanese developers had at this time about Western audiences, that they weren't good at their games and that they didn't want hard games. And so that's why the difficulty was nerfed so much in Final Fantasy 2/4. And I think that's a big part of why 5 didn't end up getting localized. I think it was planned to get localized even, but like just
Yeah, there
because
were
of
like
like
magazine scans of it and everything. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, but just
Oh,
because of like the development team's resources and maybe moving on to FF6, I think they just, and because of that whole like difficulty thing, because 5 is a complicated game. When I played it as a kid, I did not appreciate this game. Like it was just too much for me, too many choices,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the difficulty now I feel is like incredibly well balanced, but at the time, like I guess it's true, like it was too hard for me. What can I say? But yeah, I do think difficulty and that perception was a big part of that choice ultimately.
But I also think like part of it was like localization, like layover times to some degree as well. Like I think that it was like 6 was clearly, I think, to the developers' minds, and also probably people who worked in America for Square were like, this game's gonna hit because Final Fantasy 6 rules.
Mhm.
So like, this game's gonna hit, and Final Fantasy 5, like we develop it, it's gonna push our localization time back on Final Fantasy 6, which I don't even know how, because apparently Ted Woolsey, localizes Final Fantasy 6 in like 28 days or some insane number like that. That's just
Wow.
like an estimate from my brain, but it's something insane. Um, and so I think that's part of it as well. But yeah, I think that all those things are a piece of it. What's interesting is I totally forgot about this, but like they actually had originally, like Final Fantasy 4 was originally supposed to be Final Fantasy 5. I was actually reading some interviews and I was confused, and I didn't know this until like last week. um and they were gonna like make a Final Fantasy 4 also on the NES, and they scrapped it because they were already along on Final Fantasy 4. So it was interesting to see like the decisions they make back then. Like think about like development times nowadays. Like if you just scrap a Final Fantasy, that
Yeah.
would never happen. So I
Yeah,
would
see
be
you in
curious.
20 years.
Yeah, I would always be like really interested to know like what the original Final Fantasy 4 was supposed to be like. But yeah, I mean, I think Final Fantasy 6 sort of becomes like the creative breakthrough, as I think Alex puts it, of Final Fantasy. Like I think that for many, many, many people, Final Fantasy 6 is still the apex of the series. I used to agree with that, but now it's 16. Uh,
Oh yeah.
Okay, okay.
it's true.
Is it time, Alex? Is it time to gang up on this guy?
Don't worry, plenty of people have on the internet already.
Oh,
But in all sincerity, like Final Fantasy VI is important because, like, apparently it influenced the most recent Miss Walker game in terms of what Sakaguchi wanted to do. It pulls so many different things together. There are imperfections to Final Fantasy VI for sure, but you can see so much of the philosophy that Sakaguchi works with in terms of like connectedness like what we do in the face of like nihilism and like what we're supposed to do as opposed to what we actually have to do. Like something that he expands on greatly in 9. Like there's so much going on in 6. And again, like how much of that is Kitase, how much of that is Sakaguchi, I don't know. But it is a
Mm,
theme that Sakaguchi, like many of the themes that 6 brings up are themes that Sakaguchi comes back to throughout his career for the next, 30 years. Because that's how long ago that game came out. Oh, I'm so old. Anyway, you guys aren't as old as me. What about 6?
yeah, 6 is like an amazing game, and I think, speaking of taking big swings, like narratively, I think this is the first time that like these swings actually connect with like originality. Like it does manage to shock the audience in ways that 4 couldn't. As like emotional as 4 can be, it is pretty like hokey or pretty predictable at times. It's like, very melodramatic. But here the drama feels real. I mean, like, I don't know if we spoil it or not, but like the world of ruin and like that whole like second half of the game was, like, jaw-dropping as a kid, and there are moments within the whole thing, like, of course, the iconic opera scene that are just, like, I when I think of Final Fantasy, I think of that scene, like, just, I don't know, it was telling stories in a way that no game has before then, and, like, very few games have since then, I feel like, on, like, successfully pulling off that scale and that, uh, what like, that sense of urgency in the story.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it is an incredible game from, like, all aspects of game, design.
Yeah, and just what sticks out to me a lot about 6 is character writing, because, like, with 4, you had good characters already, like, super cool, memorable characters, but with 6 now, and I feel like this is a lot of Kitase's hand becoming kind of a secondary directorial force in the series, because 5, for the record, is the last project that Sakaguchi is credited as a director on. Like,
Mm,
starting with 6, he is now, like, the producer of these games, which is even more of a kind of like backline role. I mean, like, that's not completely accurate because a producer, especially in Japanese game development, still has, like, a lot of, like, ultimate say on what the game ends up looking like. But if Kitase is now sort of the one overseeing, like, more hands-on aspect of the game development, then I feel like, and being like the lead writer at the same time, I feel like this fact that Final Fantasy, we appreciate it so much for the characters and for like the nuances around them and the way they're written and the arcs they go through. A lot of that is Kitase's hand, and at this point, like that's also amplified um, by even more sort of set piece moments, like things like the Ghost Train, things like the Opera House. Like these are ultra cinematic moments that use music in really creative ways, um, develop their characters at the same time that they're presenting like this kind of impressive technology that like sort of wows the player. And again, having that mix of like whimsy and wackiness with like super deep like character drama. That's what 6 excels so well at to me, and also at this point, and this might also be Kitase's influence, like because starting with 5, like women are just starting to be written better in this series,
mm,
and
yeah.
better in
That's the
frankly
truth.
most video games around this time. Like,
Most video games around this time
yeah,
currently as well,
good point.
honestly.
Because yeah, characters like Ferris in Final Fantasy V already like, oh my god, for like a video game in the early to mid '90s, like that is such a cool characterization. And then
Mm,
Terra and Celeste are arguably the two main characters in this game, and they're just like written with so much like depth and pathos that like that's sort of a thing that I don't think we talk about so much with Final Fantasy, was like how well it was able to write women, and I figure that must be like Kitase's influence if that started happening around the time that he joined the team.
Yeah, I
y
mean, I would imagine so. I mean, like it before that, I mean, who was the coolest female character in Final Fantasy 1 through 4? Rydia, maybe,
Yeah.
who also has a lot
yeah.
of tropey weirdness to her, especially with her relationship with Edge, which, I won't go into, but yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we also haven't pointed out is like this is another game, along with 5, I think, where you see Sakaguchi or whoever's hiring at Square, but I assume that if they're coming into Final Fantasy, Sakaguchi has a say. Tetsuya Takahashi comes on, and he actually directs he designs the Magitech armor in Final
Mhm.
Fantasy VI. And if you don't know who Tetsuya Takahashi is, first of all, shame on you. And second of all, he goes on to make Xenogears, and then the Xeno sub series, sort of meta series that he is creating, and I can't wait to see what he's working on now. But Nomura actually comes on around 5 as well, right? I think.
Yep.
Also was
As
the
a
designer, and then
monster designer for 5.
yeah, for
Mhm.
5, yeah. So like again, like I think that when we're talking about Sakaguchi, like we feel like we have mentioned like 4 or 5 just like monsters of the industry, right? Like people who are just like so enormously important, and like just letting them cook, right? Like letting them do their thing. um Takahashi goes on to apparently write a scenario that he thinks is going to work for Final Fantasy VII, but they're like, nope, that's too dark, and they're probably right. And then it becomes Xenogears. Like it just like that recognition of talent, I think is just like such an underrated element of who Sakaguchi is.
And one of the interviews that I think Alex linked us to, Sakaguchi talks about how even this was like in the late 80s, every developer or every member of the team, he wanted them to like sit in and watch the other parts of the development. So I do think like even though he is the producer, like he still has his finger in every pie, you know? And I think like the reason why there are so many great like respective auteurs that came from Sakaguchi's like work team, I think that's because of like the way that they were interconnected and like they broke down this kind of silo mentality that a lot of development studios might still have today. So yeah, I mean, even talking or hearing him talk about Final Fantasy VII, a game that he didn't direct and like apparently had less of a hand in, it sounds like he still had quite a hand in it. Like he was still overseeing like almost every aspect of the development. So in a way, like he is still ushering the Final Fantasy series up until 10, I suppose, or until like the creation of 11. So yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the vague roles of a producer or executive producer, like he's still around. He's still like his influence is felt, I think.
Yeah, so like from 6 to 7, I think is obviously like to many people, it's like that's when Final Fantasy becomes like a big thing. Like obviously in this country, at least in America, um, like I had always been a fan of Final Fantasy, but like 7 like was when like the kids at my middle school were talking about Final Fantasy now. And it's also like I think when you start to see, and I don't know how much Sakaguchi is pulling away at this point, but I think it feels different. It feels very different, but it also feels very similar to what Sakaguchi has always wanted, right? Like he is actually quoted before Final Fantasy VII comes out as saying like, "Hey, like we're not competing with like Dragon Quest anymore. Now we're competing with Hollywood,"
Mm.
which
Mm.
maybe gets to some of the hubris that eventually brings him down. But I think that Final Fantasy VII is the cinematic RPG. I think like honestly, even today, like if you think about it in the terms of when it came out, like it is the most cinematic RPG I have ever played. It has these huge, big moments, and I know at least Sakaguchi's influence like is on parts of the story because he had lost his mother, and so recently when it comes out, so I know he's like sort of part of it. Like the Genova Sephiroth stuff is a little bit Sakaguchi at least. I think that he like sort of create. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, like he creates like the initial outline, and the initial outline changes a lot, but like he still has some influence on where it goes. But yeah, obviously 7 is like a milestone moment in the series, and Sakaguchi is still here for it.
Yeah, I think the actual credit for Sakaguchi on this game, aside from producer, is based on the story by, which is a really interesting
Mm.
credit to give like one of your lead creatives, because I guess he created the general concept of the story, and Polygon has like a really like nicely presented like oral history of FF7 that like honestly takes like hours to read. It's really thorough. But it sounds basically like he created the concept of the story, and then it was more concretely developed and executed by Kitase, and now we also have Nojima join the team and become sort of one of the lead writers of the series going forward. And also at the same time, Nomura, who is just, I believe, a like battle cinematic director around this time. Um, is just like apparently just pestering like the higher ups on the team with his ideas, and just like trying to like assert like more of a creative voice of his own into the series. And like, oh yeah, obviously he's the character designer too, on
These
top of being
characters need more
the
belt
visual
buckles,
director.
more zippers.
Yeah.
Please.
So there's a huge turn in the ways that like that the general aesthetic of the series at this point to be like more steeped in like modernity, which clearly resonated with the West. That Nomura was responsible for, and that this new team of like Nomura, Nojima, and Kitase would sort of become like the main like narrative drivers of the series going forward, I feel. But again, like you're describing, Zach, like Sakaguchi still had like general oversight on the game, and like a lot of role in the overall like story concept. But I feel like what a lot of people associate with like the general like tone and style of Final Fantasy is actually like those three, and what they would do from this point forward.
I do think that Sakaguchi, he had a big role to play in like the smoothening of Final Fantasy VII and like the overall game flow, because in an interview uh, between him and Uematsu, it was like a Japanese interview. He was talking about how like the battles screen, like the victory screen, he wanted everything to be perfectly like balanced between, okay, we want to load back into the overworld as quickly as possible, so like the music should be this many milliseconds, you know what I mean? Like he was very meticulous about like the pacing of everything, including like the opening scene with like the bombing mission, right, with that iconic cinematic music in the beginning. He was like kind of helping dictate to Uematsu, like, here's the exact pace, like second for second, like we have to introduce this person's name, and then like it should open onto this like splash screen. Like he was really involved in that. And there's like a great story about how like Uematsu says that he went away and like worked on his own for the music for that opening, and when they finally put it together, he showed Sakaguchi, and Sakaguchi like started crying, but he was like hiding his tears, and then he's like, what do you think? And he just goes, good, and then just like went home. Like he gave no, no notes to Uematsu at that point. But like, yeah, you could tell very much he was involved in like the overall flow of everything.
It's always sort of the impression that I get about Sakaguchi, like, well, regardless of like how he's named on the credits, right? That he is sort of like hovering. And sometimes the manager hovering is bad, but in his case, I think the hovering was always about like, and I think that Yoshi P nowadays is sort of like in that role with Final Fantasy 14. He's a hoverer. Like how can we make this work specifically for our audience? How can we make this specifically work for our audience? And like, if you ever listen to Yoshi P talk, who I guess I should probably point out, he's the director of Final Fantasy 14 nowadays, like, and also 16. Like these are people who were like always sort of like over, like looking over people's shoulders, but in ways to make it work better. And I think that's like the attention to detail that Sakaguchi brought, I think is a really important thing to point out, sort of from the quality of what Final Fantasy VII does.
I feel like Final Fantasy VII really just is like the perfect storm and combination of all of Square's talents around this time, just collaborating smoothly, uh, doing like the most with their ideas, and having like Sakaguchi be like the main like driving force in terms of like directing them and like getting the most out of all their talents. And like some of his like the themes from the earlier Final Fantasy, even though they're sort of like transformed with this like new emphasis on like modernity and like these more like almost like complex surreal moments that I feel like Nojima really thrives on, are still rooted in like a rebellion, except like instead of like this being like a sort of like more generic like fantasy rebellion against an evil empire, now you're a group of like eco terrorists battling like an evil corporation. And
Mhm.
But
this,
wait, Final Fantasy is not political though.
no, of course
Like, it's
video
not.
games aren't political, at least the good
No, they're
ones.
not supposed to be.
No,
Yeah.
no, of course not. But
Aren't
but
Shinra
yeah,
the
and
good guys? Wait, hold on.
Elon Musk would probably say so.
the real life Rufus Shinra.
Oh
Yeah.
my god, yeah.
um but yeah, like the also like this theme of like sort of like the planet having like its own life force, and every version of life being connected. Like we also see that in Sakaguchi's upcoming works.
Mhm.
So like FF7 really just like feels like not only the culmination of everything that comes before, but everything that comes after. And I mean, for that reason, it's just that's why its reputation is still like kind of unknockable. Like you can mention flaws about this game, but like its reputation can't really be marred. It's too
Yeah.
significant. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, and I guess I just sort of thought of this now. Like, I think that Sakaguchi becomes particularly interested in concepts of memory and, like, what has come before. I think about in particular Lost Odyssey, which we'll talk about, but like that is certainly an important concept in this game, right? Like it continues into 9, and then it continues through a lot of the rest of his work. And so I think that you're right. I hadn't really thought about like he's really interested in these people's pasts, and he's really interested in like what has come before and how does that define how we move forward, when he is the writer, which we'll come up to that very soon here. And so I think that you're right. Like I think 7, regardless of whether he came up with that idea, it's one that he likes and that he
Mm.
pulls forward.
Yeah, I think
Right.
memory is another a big one, and I was actually thinking more from the theme of memory, like, oh, this is like clearly Nojima's obsession because FF8 and then Kingdom
Mhm.
Hearts like is just all about like memory as well, but in like a much more like surreal, weird way. But you're right, totally right that Sakaguchi is dealing with that theme in later works in his own sort of way.
Yeah, we haven't brushed on the themes yet, but they are like the pattern is starting to show of like the balance between industrialization and the nature, which is kind of represented through magic, right? I mean, like even the Magitech in FF6, that's one of the major themes, right? And yeah, the voice of the planet becomes a running thing, probably starting with 7, but I think there's aspects of it before 7 even.
I mean, I
And
think 6 is pulling from that a lot. Like,
yeah,
like if you're thinking about like, and he's interested in concepts of like different races and
mm,
immortality and people coming together and splitting and wars, but also like all the stuff with the espers is very earthy, right? You can pull that all the way back to 1 if you really want to. So yeah, I think it's always been there.
right, and the idea of like this ancient race that kind of surpassed humanity but was destroyed, and like they're back to kind of reclaim their place, like that pops up in a lot of Sakaguchi stuff. Which I mean, like less than 7, but you could argue with like Genova, there's kind of like this primeval, I don't know, like god character that's present, but more in like FF9, FF6, and then like his movie that he makes later.
I mean, I think that you could even make that argument like the Lunarians, like sort of are like that, right?
Mm.
Mm,
In Final Fantasy IV. So yeah, I mean, like I think that like there like to some degree, it's hard to separate between like what's like RPG trope and what's Sakaguchi created, because so much of them become interchangeable eventually, right? Like it's like Sakaguchi exerts, or at least Final Fantasy itself exerts such an influence over the wider sphere of RPGs, even more than Dragon Quest, I think, because even though obviously, as you said, like Dragon Quest is much more popular in Japan, Japanese developers know that Final Fantasy is more popular over here, which has a much larger audience base.
yeah, I think you are right. Like the tropes of RPGs, especially JRPGs, like those are just Sakaguchi's doing for the most part. I feel like, or at least he established them as like mainstays of the genre.
Especially if you're thinking of like angsty main characters like Cloud Strife, let's go.
Oh, and I am, yeah.
I mean,
Is that
speaking
a
of angsty main
yeah,
characters,
yeah, good transition. I was gonna say, are we
that is
talking
a
about 8
great
now?
transition. We could talk about Squall. But what's interesting is that I actually feel like from everything I've read, Final Fantasy VIII, from like the first 9, which were the ones you worked on, is the one that Sakaguchi exerts by far the least influence on.
Mhm. Yeah,
Mm,
in this case, he's not even like a producer. Like he's executive producer on this game,
Right.
which shows like an even further detachment. And I'm pretty sure FF8 and FF9's development were sort of happening at the same time. And I mean, FF9, it's like the most hands-on Sakaguchi almost ever was. So
mm,
it's interesting to think about FF8 and FF9 at the same time because I feel
They're
like
so different.
that's the best way we can sort of separate Sakaguchi's main concerns and his sort of
Mhm.
autorial voice aside
Uh,
from like this other group of creatives he was cultivating at the time.
I read somewhere that like Sakaguchi's only like his one of his most major contributions to Final Fantasy VIII was like sort of like a very like overbroad thematic concerns. Like he looked at the script and he's like, I feel like this is really like a story about love between Squall and Manoa,
Hmm.
obviously. And so they're like, oh, okay, you're right. Let's like adjust the script to make it more about love. And I think that like Sakaguchi is like I think sometimes to a fault, is like so like sort of like fundamental and elemental in like the way that he understands storytelling. Like it's about this, like I feel like it's
Mm.
like I don't know. I'm an English teacher, so Spark Notes. Like if it's a Spark Notes was describing the theme of something, and sometimes I feel like he does that. He sort of serves it up. Like it's let's simplify it down to its core, and I think that he does that. But also, like I think that he's right. Like Final Fantasy VIII is a love story above anything else. For any criticisms you might have of it, it's a love story, and Sakaguchi got that.
Hmm. Yeah, and clearly his influence with like trying to present it as a love story got through to Nomura and Nojima in a pretty good way because it's a much better love story than any Kingdom Hearts game. So I feel like that that was a good influence for Sakaguchi there.
Low bar.
Yeah. The love story thing. I do think though, like FF8 and FF2 actually do have a few things like a few similarities, right? I mean, they're both kind of considered oddballs of the series, for their battle system or for their like leveling and development system, right? The whole like weird magic siphoning in FF8, and also something I noticed like the other day playing FF2. One of the four main characters, Leon, I think he is in English, right? Leon, is that right, Alex?
Yep, yep.
His Japanese name is like Reion Haruto, like Leonhart, which I'm like,
Ah,
hold on a
interesting.
second, yeah, like Squall Leonhart. So I wonder if like they were paying some love back to Sakaguchi's FF2 in that. I mean, it's a small thing, but I do think they both stand apart from the rest of the series.
No, you gotta be honest, like, cause Leon from FF2 was definitely Final Fantasy's first angsty bastard, so there's definitely a connection there.
Was he the best looking guy in the room though?
Oh yeah, most handsome of the main cast, no doubt.
Most, yeah, for as far as like blocky faces go, yeah, pretty good
I
looking.
mean, I mean, blocky faces continued on to Final Fantasy VIII. Very good. So yeah, I mean, like speaking of like influences, though, like sort of like we'll talk about 10 a little bit, but really the reality is that like in terms of the mainline games, Sakaguchi's involvement sort of peaks and also ends with Final Fantasy IX. And I will say that I have spoken for hours on Final Fantasy IX recently, so I will not do that right now, but I will let both of you talk about sort of Sakaguchi's influences, themes, stuff like that as it comes through in 9.
Yeah, I mean, I listened to the previous two episodes. I think Wes put it really nicely. Like Wes had a lot of good things to say about FF9 as like the swan song for Sakaguchi, and it does feel like the end of an era. Um, for one thing, it's like the last traditional overworld that Final Fantasy has had, I think, since then. And like bringing back the crystals, bringing back the fantasy elements mixed with like the hints of steampunk. Um, the characters are all like traditional classes in a way. Like, I mean, Vivi obviously is like the black mage visually, and Steiner is this like, knight. But yeah, I don't know. It does feel like the most like stage showy too. Like, I mentioned earlier the theatricality. I mean, FF9 is bookended with like performances, like on stage performances, right? That's how we're introduced to a lot of the main characters, like Zidane. So yeah, I don't know. FF9 does feel really meticulous in its way of being like, okay, this is like we've been toying with sci-fi in the past few entries. From this point onward, Final Fantasy is going to be free to explore whatever genre it wants to. And I think like since then, since 10 and onward, it's been like much harder to pin down as being like oh, this is like a typical Final Fantasy crystals, blah blah blah, like Dwarf Kingdom, blah blah blah. Now it's a lot more open, I think, with just a few of the callbacks to monster designs and things like that. But yeah, it definitely is like a beautiful send off to the first 2 decades almost. Or I guess first like 15 years of Final Fantasy.
Yeah, and it seems like he was kind of branding FF9 as like a true return to fantasy.
Mm.
Because although he clearly had a hand in like the more realistic world and characters that FF7 and even more so FF8 started getting into, there was a clear emphasis with the 9 in terms of trying to bring back like a feeling of fantasy. And a lot of that has to do with both like moving away from Nomura as a character designer, to look at like uh conceiving of characters like with more unique proportions, not really like humanoid but almost like deformed in all their own unique ways. And these unique shapes and appearances of the characters all supported their own like personalities and the own like the unique struggles all these characters were going through. So like there's a clear like shift in terms of like what this game looked like. It is a lot more colorful. It was again a lot less steeped in modernism. But at the same time it was bridging like the early pure fantasy of like Final Fantasy with the more mature storytelling that the series started exploring with like 6, 7, 8. And on that note, like this is clearly like Sakaguchi's like culmination of what he thinks this series was under his like vision, like is epitomized with 9.
Yeah, and I think that he does a good job too of bringing in some of the goofiness that you guys were talking about. That I think, and I think you argued this excellently, Alex. Katase brought in, there's still like a lot of levity here. That's one of the things we talked about a lot in that episode. But I also think like some of like the obsessions that he continues to carry forward are really crystallized here. Sort of like the idea of like planet life force almost, and what sort of drives planets. We saw it in 7. We will see it very soon here in the Spirits Within. Like sort of these other races trying to survive in different ways. The concept of memory, and like Memoria is the literal embodiment of that as the final dungeon. um and memory is something that he explores through his Mistwalker oeuvre as well, even through his most recent game. So I think that 9 is interesting as a pivot point because like it reflects everything that Final Fantasy has been about, but it also reflects everything that Sakaguchi is obsessed with and will continue to be obsessed with as he moves forward into, other things. And granted, like I think Spirits Within was probably written and directed and, given the complexity of that movie before this, it's still like you can see the through line here of what he's really interested in.
Yeah, I remember even like seeing an interview that he noted that he was writing because like again like Sakaguchi is this is his first real job as like the lead writer of the game. I think there were like a couple of co-writers, but this is like his first time as lead writer of the series, so it's clearly like a project personal to him. But he was writing it at the same time that he was doing Spirits Within, and he actually said that the theme of those two games is the same. Like he was trying to communicate the same thing with both
He
these
did it much
stories.
better in one than the other.
Exactly.
And let's say the name of that better one. 3, 2, 1.
Spirits
Spirits
Within.
Within,
Oh, of course.
masterpiece,
Of course.
right? That's what
Right
we all
on.
think. That's what we're gonna talk about now.
That's good a transition as any. Yeah, I mean, like, you guys might be familiar with like the Gaia hypothesis or like Gaia theory of like the Earth is a living organism and we're all like bacteria or like parts of that organism. And like he literally calls these planets like Gaia, right, in the Spirits Within, and it also in FF9. Is it Gaia is the name of the world? I think.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty clear in that sense. But yeah, shall we jump in Spirits Within? I mean, I just watched it for the first time a couple days ago, and I was like, "Is this the right movie? Is this a Final Fantasy movie?" Until the
Please tell me
final
your thoughts, because
15
I watched it
minutes.
again like 3 weeks ago, and I already remember almost nothing about it because it's that
Oh
memorable.
my,
But
I
please tell me
okay.
your thoughts on it.
I knew it was going to be like a sleepy movie, so I was focused as hell on the movie. I'm like, okay, I gotta like be ready to talk about this, and I was just like fading in and out my attention. Like it has the cardinal sin of like it's not like laughably bad because then it would be enjoyable in that way. It's just like it's so milk toast, like bland. You know what I mean? And it doesn't have any of the Final Fantasy identity except for like, oh, this character's name is Dr. Sid. There's no recognizable monsters or music or anything, right? It's just like a kind of wooden sci-fi movie until again like the last like 15 minutes. Then like all of these things that you were talking about with FF9, all the thematic points come into play of like, I hear the voice of the earth and like it's crying and like this alien race came here on an asteroid and they want to take over now, but are they really bad or are humans bad? It was a lot of that like crammed into the final 10 minutes of that movie, I think. But Alex, what'd you think of The Spirits Within?
Yeah, it was. Oh man, I watched it pretty late at night, and I also don't remember too much. But I mean, what I will say is that yes, I could see how this is a movie that Sakaguchi wrote and expresses a lot of his main narrative themes that he's interested in and that he wants to get across in his games. But more than anything, I think this movie demonstrates how much the appeal and themes and personality of Final Fantasy do depend on the people around him, because none of the other creative forces we've been describing so far are involved with this movie at all.
Mm,
And it just shows in the look of the characters, the writing, the general aesthetic of it all. It looks bland. None of the characters really stand out in terms of how they look or how they talk. And Final Fantasy did sort of always have Western influences, but this movie just leans so hard into traditional Western movie character tropes and aesthetics, to the point where it just doesn't feel like Final Fantasy anymore. Despite there being thematic connections between them, this is barely a Final Fantasy movie like watching the thing.
I mean, especially like late 90s, early 2000s tropes. Like it's like some of the action stuff. I was like, come on, man.
you know what it
Like,
felt like? It felt like the Matrix. Like anytime that they're not in the Matrix, when they're like on the Nebuchadnezzar, I'm like, oh yes, the part of the Matrix that everybody hates. Like, let's make that into a
yeah,
full movie. You know?
that is a really good comparison. I've never thought about that, but it's completely apt.
With the nuance of thematic depth of James Cameron's Avatar. That's
Right.
Oh,
yeah.
Exactly. And I will say this, I think that gets to one of Sakaguchi's fundamental flaws as a creator, which is that he likes the broad. He likes the big
oh,
in a ways that are extremely obvious. And a lot of Japanese creators are like that. I say this as a person who obviously adores Japanese RPGs, but it's the reason that a lot of people prefer Western RPGs, right? I think a lot of times Western RPGs do a better job with nuance, and that and Japanese RPGs do a better job with big and broad, and his desire to combine those two things makes it a complete failure thematically, in my opinion.
I I do have to say, like, in the past few years, I've replayed a lot of the older FF games in Japanese just to see how they compare and like as a way of like, I don't know, studying, I guess. And there is more nuance in like the dialogue, just inherent in like the Japanese language of like, a lot of times subjects are omitted from sentences and like a lot is left unsaid. And I think like, a lot of the localization and translation that comes into English, you might lose some of that subtlety. But I mean, yeah, it is, I very much agree. It is very melodramatic and like operatic. Like it's going big, right? Like he's definitely hitting you over the head with like, I don't know, technology bad, magic, nature good, you know. It's definitely yeah, and I do think it's also least subtle when Japanese games or media in general is trying to ape like westernisms of like action movies, for example. Like it does
Hmm.
feel
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
wooden and like unnatural, and it's like no, like I don't think this is what we want. Like I don't need like Bruce Willis to be in my Final Fantasy. Like you know what I mean? I don't need Die Hard to be mixed with
I
Final
mean, speak for
Fantasy.
yourself. I'll take Bruce Willis in my Final Fantasy. Thank
Yabba
you
dabba
very
doo.
much. Yeah, so as we're coming to the end of Sakaguchi's oeuvre in Final Fantasy, I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that he was involved in a lot of games before he left Squaresoft. Some of the games are big, like Parasite Eve. Some of
Mhm.
the games are really big, like Chrono Trigger. So where do we see Sakaguchi's influence in some of these spheres, like Final Fantasy Tactics, for example, as well. Like he wanted to make, but he couldn't, and then he brings in Matsuno, and then
Mhm.
like obviously Matsuno makes like a classic. I'm not sure that he necessarily brought in Matsuno, but Matsuno came in to Squaresoft, or to Square. So he has a lot of influence in this era of Square, where they make a lot of very successful, very excellent games. We're talking like 94 through 99 here. So how do we see sort of his hand working there?
I think like his hand is less visible than it is in Final Fantasy, just in the nature of his role. But I mean, like, it can't be a coincidence that like the amount of quality, and in games like Mario RPG, uh, Tactics, like you said, Chrono Trigger, Front Mission, you know what I mean? Like all these like iconic things that spun off into their own series. So in a way, like if he's the father of Final Fantasy, I think he grandfathered like so many iconic RPG franchises. But maybe just like in terms of his influence, like the quality, the smoothness of a lot of these games, like I guarantee that he was like giving people advice on how to make everything run as optimally as possible, given the hardware.
Yeah, that's a good point. Definitely leveraging like the technology of the time to like its best ends. I feel like that's something he's done throughout all his career to this point. And we see that also in like these producer credits, and most of these are like executive producer credits, so probably projects that he didn't have a huge hand on, but like that includes like Xenogears, Bushido Blade, Legend of Mana, like tons of like ultra creative, stylish titles. Like that's another thing I think of in terms of Sakaguchi is just like the style his games have, like, and the way they were able to like bring in like a distinctly like Japanese like aesthetic, but merge it with uh an appeal to like an international audience. And like I know like reading about Final Fantasy VII, like apparently the original story concept was like set in like New York rather than like the fictional city of like Midgar. And I mean we see that with one of his like main producer credits, which is Parasite Eve, a game that's literally set in New York with kind of more of a fantasy and sci-fi elements um, added on top of that. And yeah, FF Tactics is another one that he has like a lead producer role. So yeah, even outside of Final Fantasy, he was like defining the Squaresoft brand at that time, which I mean a lot of people would look back on and call like the company's like peak in terms of like artistry and style and
Mm.
innovativeness. So even talking about this guy apart from Final Fantasy, like he's contributed so much to this industry, specifically on the PS1.
And Vagrant story as well. And also like it's worth saying that before he exited Square, he was the one that like pushed forward the idea of turning Final Fantasy into an MMO with FF11. He was actually the guy like behind that, even though he didn't see it through to completion.
And now he's one of the most common players of Final Fantasy 14.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Um, like one of the things that gives me life is hearing Sakaguchi talk about Final Fantasy 14 and just how much he loves it, and like conversations between him and Yoshi P are just like they're so pure. Like it's so
Mm.
excellent to see.
Yeah, there's no bad blood between him and Square Enix like at all. I mean, he appears in every single like so and so anniversary of like any of the games. He's always willing to talk and share. So yeah, I love that he's like kept this kind of fatherly role over
Mhm.
the JRPG genre.
Yeah. I mean, I think that before we move on to Mistwalker, I think it's important to kind of like kind of talk about his roles outside of Final Fantasy. But I think the most obvious role is with the Chrono Trigger. And no matter how many like interviews I read or things I read about his involvement in Chrono Trigger, it is very unclear how much like Hori and Sakaguchi, like how they made decisions between the two of them, except that like they made decisions differently and then they came to a different conclusion than maybe that either of them originally had. And I think like if you're thinking about Sakaguchi over the course of his whole like career at Squaresoft and even at Mistwalker, to be honest with you, like his ability to like, especially like after like the NES era of Final Fantasy, to hear other ideas and to understand other ideas. And obviously he's going to respect someone like Yuji Horii on Chrono Trigger, like to create what is, I think, what many people I think consider to be, if not the greatest RPG of all time, the most perfect RPG
Mm.
of all
Mhm.
time. I think that it speaks to like what his real talent is, which is talent recognition and allowing people to cook.
I do think like part of that might be part of like, the Japanese work culture of like the humility of not taking sole credit for things. Like that's why there are so few auteurs maybe. Like people are so quick to not this is not a criticism, but people are so quick to call themselves an auteur in the West, right? It's like remember American McGee's Alice in Wonderland, right? It's like who the hell is American McGee? Like, oh, he wrote one game prior to that. So people try to establish themselves as like the sole creator, whereas I think it is they share the credit a lot more, at least in the JRPG space from what I've seen, right? They they share the victory and share the defeat for the most part. But Chrono Trigger, uh, yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna throw my hat in. Another guy on the internet talking about how great Chrono Trigger is. I mean, like, yeah, like you said, Zach, one of the most perfect games ever made, right? And like such a huge swing of like the different settings and like the varied cast of characters, and like it just all comes together so perfectly. Um, the gameplay is like fast and fun and unique, and the music is amazing and cinematic and beautiful, and it's got a great sense of humor. Yeah, I mean, the Chrono Trigger might be one of the only things that we haven't seen a remake of it in so long since the DS, but like it doesn't even need a remake. Like you just need to re-release it,
Yeah,
and
no,
Yeah.
modern
no
audiences
thanks.
can love it. You know,
Yeah, and it just
but
so seamlessly combines like Yuji Hoри's like kind of sense of like purity in terms of like his game design and like his love of like colorful aesthetics with Sakaguchi's more cinematic sort of sensibilities, his sense of style and storytelling. And for that like just pretty much perfect combination, like it's no wonder this game remains like unsurpassed in so many people's eyes.
I mean, I also think you can see like Hori and Sakaguchi like sort of bringing Kato like sort of like under
mm,
their wings. Or whereas you see Kato's work later, like with Cross, which
Yeah.
whenever you think of it, like it's messy, right? Like Sakaguchi and Hori weren't going to let this game be messy. And I think that is just like it speaks to their ability to take someone who I think is remarkably talented in Kato and make them make something that is perfect.
I can't imagine being like a fly on the wall, or like even like more so a young developer or writer like sitting in the room with like Hori and Akira Toriyama and Sakaguchi. Like talk about pressure to perform, right? Like you're sitting between these like media gods of the East. But yeah, like what a dream team, and it just came together. It's a shame that I mean Chrono Cross, great game, but just like doesn't feel exactly like a Chrono Trigger sequel. You know what I mean? Like that definitely is a point in time that will never be recaptured, I think. But
I mean, and that sort of continues after Sakaguchi leaves, right? It's like Sakaguchi leaves Squaresoft technically somewhere in like the 2001 to 2003 range. It's a little unclear. Like he's credited on Final Fantasy X, but like the reality is that like he had no influence on Final Fantasy X. Maybe some of the very very initial stuff in terms of greenlighting it. As you put it out earlier, he was part of greenlighting Final Fantasy 11 to being an MMO, but then he leaves and he does exactly what everybody's dream is, which is just go to Hawaii for 3 years and surf, not have a job, not worry about anything else. Sounds awesome. And for some reason, he decided to go back to work, which I would not do. And he creates the studio Mistwalker, which is where he still works. And one of the interesting things about Mistwalker, and if you look even at the Wikipedia page for it, is Mistwalker is like like sort of position themselves as like, hey, we are like sort of like a set of experts in the field, and we're gonna help different developers make good stuff. I'm not sure that they've been entirely successful in that endeavor, but apparently that's very rare in sort of Japanese game development. And the reality is that, like, really, like in terms of console RPGs, they make. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong here, but like 4 console RPGs, which is really where I want us to focus here, because
Yeah.
they make Terra Battle, which I don't think was very big in the West, and I have no experience with. but if anyone wants to speak to it, they're welcome to. Blue Dragon, and then Lost Odyssey, and then The Last Story, and then most recently, Fantasian or Neo Fantasian. And they have like all these sort of interesting ways of playing with the genre in different ways, but they are all extremely Sakaguchi. And I will admit that I have only played like the first like 5 hours of Blue Dragon, and I thought it was like classic boring, but he did work with Toriyama on it, which again, like, is him pulling in like an expert in the field to work with him. But Aleks, I know you've played Blue Dragon, so how Sakaguchi is Blue Dragon?
Yeah, I mean, you asked the question like why the hell did he go back to work after being so comfortable in Hawaii after having like already a legendary career? And I think a lot of that was just like Microsoft approaching him with big money, wanting to attract some Japanese talent to make the Xbox 360 have more of a global appeal. And just being like, do you want to make a couple of essentially follow-ups to Final Fantasy for us? Because both Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey are fundamentally like continuations of Final Fantasy and continuations of different aspect of Final Fantasy, like continuations of like different styles, different sensibilities, and different eras of that series. Like Blue Dragon to me feels like a successor to the more lighthearted tone and like uh focus on like fantasy and whimsy and like from a gameplay perspective job systems of like FF5 and FF9. And for the record, I mean, Sakaguchi is not alone at this point. He still has his most crucial weapon, Uematsu, on his side. And Uematsu's contributions to Blue Dragon remind me a lot of those two games, FF5 and FF9. It's kind of more bouncy, more whimsical, more fantastical. Overall, like there's still like these central concern of like themes about like technology and its impact on uh, ecological disasters and like the game essentially begins with this like technological shark like destroying like the village of like the kids that are sort of the main protagonists. So there's like by having like children essentially as the protagonists, there's this more focus on like innocence and like combating like the evil of like industry and things like that with their this power they unlock like these shadow selves that they can use, which is also like serves as the main like implementation of the job system. And the job system's very familiar. Like you can switch between these different shadow cells, which have their own like skills they contribute to. And so Blue Dragon really feels like, yeah, like a successor to like those aspects of Final Fantasy. And Lost Odyssey, I would argue, is a successor to a whole different aspect of Final Fantasy. But if anyone else has any comments of Blue Dragon, um,
I have not played like either Lost Odyssey or Blue
Mhm.
Dragon, but I mean, to me, from an outsider perspective, it seems like Blue Dragon is like a clear appeal to like the Japanese audience of like, hey, like remember Dragon Quest? Remember, Toriyama? Just visually, it seems like it's trying to gain a foothold in Japan. Whereas Lost Odyssey seems more like an appeal to the Chinese market, just with like the serious like interpretation of the magical industrialization and like the aesthetics of it. It feels more like a 360 game, like the color palette. But I will
It's very
say,
brown, yes.
very brown, yeah. And I will say for both of those games, like today, if you go to any shop in Japan, like an electronics store or something, you will not find an Xbox or even a single Xbox game. So they kind of tried and failed with like this last hurrah with Sakaguchi. But I will say, like, if you go to a retro game shop, if you manage to find like the Xbox shelf, you're likely to find a copy of Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey. Like those are two of like the holders on, I guess, like, that were actually passed around successfully over here. So I think like they did as well as they could in the Japanese market, but yeah, too little, too late maybe for, how do you trump Sony and Nintendo at their own,
Yeah.
audience? So
It's interesting because, like, apparently the reason that there are two reasons that Sakaguchi decided to work with Xbox, like, according to him at least, right? Like, one is like he hated the person who was in charge of Sony at the time, and the other is like PS3 was too hard to work on, and that second one is like a common refrain about the PS3. But yeah, like I played a little bit of Blue Dragon, and I agree with you. Like it's very much like a, hey, Japanese audience, come play this thing. And that was basically like the beginning and end of my interest in it. And it's sort of like it to some degree it sours me on Sakaguchi's like output, because like that game doesn't do much. And I will say that Lost Odyssey is a game that I do not like. I actually actively dislike it. However, it is a game that like is trying to do something, right? Like so like I think when you think about like concepts of memory, it is something that Sakaguchi is 100% interested in. This idea of like sort of immortality, which is something he deals with a lot in what he's doing. But I also think like he does some interesting things in terms of because he's not the director here, but certainly Sakaguchi, I'm sure, is exerting a lot of influence here. Like in terms of what turn-based combat is trying to do, like it tries to make turn-based combat like slow but cinematic,
Mhm.
and that was like a direction that like maybe turn-based combat might have gone. So he's still trying to press the boundaries within that space. But to me, like Lost Odyssey is mostly defined by its storytelling, like by the beautiful, stunning, amazing stories that are not written by Sakaguchi. And the story that Sakaguchi writes that has nothing to do with those stories, even though they hypothetically do. But regardless of how much I hate Lost Odyssey, I do think it's interesting that like you see like sort of the through line of his obsession with memory here and life and death and all that stuff.
If Blue Dragon is like sort of a successor to like the more lighthearted aspects of Final Fantasy, like Lost Odyssey is to me like a successor to like the more mature and melancholic tones of Final Fantasy 7 and Final Fantasy 8. And also has sort of the more free form character building that those two games had, with the fact that like you have both mortal and immortal party members, and your um, mortal party members all have sort of linear skill progressions, and then your immortal ones can sort of form bonds with the mortal ones and sort of inherit their skills. It's really creative and like well implemented system, both from a gameplay perspective and like a narrative perspective. And I mean, we, like Lost Odyssey was my first podcast here, Zach, and as you know, I disagree with you. I think this is an absolutely brilliant game. Because like for all the faults of Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey, like I feel like they're long, they're slow, they're a little tonally awkward and cheesy at times. And these are all obviously issues if you're looking for like the sort of narrative ambition and execution of like the best Final Fantasies. But at the same time, like conceptually, they're well thought out. Like in terms of like Sakaguchi being a story planner more than like a story executor, I think both of these games are still quite well thought out. And I think like all of these Mistwalker games, like Sakaguchi is bringing on like a different, like honestly brilliant character designer. Like Blue Dragon had Toriyama, as we mentioned. Lost Odyssey is I believe the only video game to have Vagabond and Slam Dunk creator Takahiko Inoue as a character designer, and I think he did a great job with this cast, despite the fact that in the actual cutscenes they don't come off as super awesome characters. But again, like the concepts behind these games and Lost Odyssey in particular, I think are very strong even when the execution is off. And I also would argue that despite the combat feeling slow at times, these are like two of the best like classical turn-based games in terms of balance. Like I know you just kind of sped through to the end of Lost Odyssey because you hated it, Zach. But the fourth disc of this game, which is honestly probably half of my overall playtime, was in the fourth disc, is just basically all optional content. But it was all like some of the most well balanced, strategic, engaging turn-based combat
Yeah.
I've experienced. That fourth disc, and I know like you're a big fan of the combat in Fantasian, which we'll get to,
Yeah.
but like that well thought out balance was already here with Lost Odyssey,
Mhm.
particularly the end. And um yeah, I'm a big fan of these games, Lost Odyssey in particular, despite their flaws.
I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, I think that one of the things that people don't give Sakaguchi maybe even enough credit for is the way that he understood combat balancing. And I think that a lot of his games, at least in their original form, are extremely well balanced. And I think that, like, you're right. Like I with Lost Odyssey, I was like, I am done with this like mishmash of like horrible main story with like these stunningly beautiful short stories that literally don't make any sense together. Like they contradict each other. The pieces and parts were there, and actually a lot of the combat elements in Lost Odyssey are there in Final Fantasy IX too. Like the skill system is very similar in many ways between Lost Odyssey and Final Fantasy IX,
But
which I think is cool.
better.
Yeah, I don't even necessarily disagree with you. I think the skill system in nine is sort of annoying to manage, but interestingly, like the first game in a long time that Sakaguchi directs is the next one, like the next console game for Mistwalker, which is a game I have not played at all. It's the only Sakaguchi game I've never touched, which is The Last Story, um, which I've heard a lot of good things about, especially in terms of the combat. And I think that it shows like Sakaguchi's willingness to experiment with like what he's good at, which is like gameplay design. So like I know you've played The Last Story, Alex. So what did you think of it?
I love The Last Story. I think it's such a cool, unique JRPG. Like, there's still really nothing quite like it, and it's not a perfect game, just like the other two Mistwalker games we were just discussing. Like, it has its flaws in terms of execution, but like this is like again like Sakaguchi's first directorial role since Final Fantasy V, so he was much more hands-on with the actual development. It was on the Wii rather than the Xbox 360, so it was part of like a different sort of deal they struck. Um, and I feel like it was a conscious response to the overall negative reception that Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey got, particularly from like Western critics around their time of the release for having like traditional turn-based RPG design, but also just being slow on top of that. Like both of those games, but especially Blue Dragon, were not critically beloved at all. They also came out at a time that there was a lot of sort of like Western critics in particular and audiences were sort of sick of Japanese RPGs. They seem to have like outgrown them, and there was also kind of some subtle racism going on at the time in the discourse around them.
Mhm.
But Last Story was clearly consciously pulling away from that tradition and trying to innovate. And how did they innovate? They essentially blended the sort of the sensibilities of Final Fantasy with the gameplay of Gears of War. Because the best way I could describe the combat of this game is like a cover slasher. Like you actually have like a cover mechanic. You have sort of like active commands you can do out of that. It's a squad based sort of battle system, also sort of in tune with Gears of War. I think the characters are generally good. It follows like a band of mercs who are trying to move up in the world by becoming knights. There's like a really like well told and nuanced romance story at the center of it as well, where like the main character falls in love with a princess. They both fall in love with each other before they like even realize what that they're in completely different spheres of the world, and they're sort of trying to negotiate and manage that relationship um, through like its different like phases, like as they're also dealing with the reality of like the politics involved with where their lives are going. Really well told. Um, and like it was part of the Operation Rainfall trilogy of games, including like Xenoblade Chronicles and Pandora's Tower, and so it actually has like um, really nice like British voice cast supporting the characters. Like unlike the really wooden cutscenes and dialogues of Lost Odyssey or Blue Dragon, like there's some actually nicely acted scenes in this game. And it just feels to me like a very logical sort of end to Sakaguchi's career, which is what is supposed to be at the time. Like the title "The Last Story" is clearly playing off of Final Fantasy, which the original Final
Mhm.
Fantasy was also supposed to be like Sakaguchi's last game, Square's last game. And so it like takes that idea of like having a more cinematic RPG, like even more literally using like the ideas of essentially Western shooters, And it did so in a way that is both clunky and very cool. And also, like, shout out to the character designer, Kimihiko Fujisaka, who was also the artist for the Dragon Guard games. Again, working with another
Hmm.
great character designer for some really nice art.
You are almost convincing me to pull out my Wii U, Alex, so I can play the last story because like that sounds like my jam. And it's the only Sakaguchi game like that he's been like, at least to my knowledge, that isn't mobile because I'm not interested. Uh, Game that he's been seriously involved in that I really want to play. Like it sounds like really interesting, and I it's only like 20 hours, right?
Yeah, 20 to 30 hours depending on how
Okay.
many side quests you
Mhm.
do.
There is one more game on the console. Like there are some mobile games like Sakaguchi got involved in some mobile games like Terra Battle and things like that. I will be honest with you, at least personally, I have nothing to say about those games. I haven't played them. I haven't touched them.
All I can say is that they look fantastic from over the shoulder of a salaryman on the train, and that's all I can say about them. They look fun.
But I have played his most recent game, which is Fantasian, which he was like heavily involved in from my experience. And actually, apparently, what happened was like he played Final Fantasy VI, and he was like, "I want to make another emotional game like Final Fantasy VI." And I will say on that front, he failed absolutely. um, the story of Fantasian is bad, like it's real bad. Like it's like a parody of like what Final Fantasy VI would be, but it does follow a lot of the structures of Final Fantasy VI. And one of the things that I think is interesting about Fantasian is that it doesn't do anything fancy, not really, with like turn-based combat. In many ways, it actually feels like Final Fantasy X, in terms of the way that you see turn order and things like that, which has become very common, I think, in RPGs nowadays. It's sort of like the opposite direction that we might have gone from Lost Odyssey, and it's the direction we actually did go. But it is, in my opinion, without doing anything crazy or insane in terms of turn-based combat, like the best turn-based combat in a video game that I think I am I going to say this? I think I'm going to say it. It's the best turn-based combat I've ever played.
Wow.
Not
It
Dragon Quest
is.
11? Oh my god.
I mean, Dragon Quest XI's like so much easier in this game. It doesn't require nearly the level of strategy. Like Fantasian is just like a pure strategic experience. Like you have to think about everything in a boss battle.
Mhm.
And it has a reputation in the second half or the second 2/3 really for being like oppressively difficult. And I'm going to sound like a jerk when I say this. I don't agree. I think it is oppressively requiring you to think about your situation. And it's interesting that you talked earlier, Alex, about Lost Odyssey because I always kind of wanted to experiment with that with that combat system. I liked it, but like it was just a little too slow for me. Whereas Fantasian, I can see where Sakaguchi was trying to implement some very Final Fantasy VI ideas, and I don't want to spoil anything. This is too new of a game, at least if you're playing on console, for me to spoil it. There are some very Final Fantasy VI ideas narratively, but like the way that he's using something extremely traditional in terms of his combat system to create something extremely, in my opinion, like new, in terms of like the fairness, but also the challenge of the different encounter designs. And like they're all different and they're all challenging, and like none of them are cheap. Like I've played a lot of games since then. I think Final Fantasy IX has more cheap bosses than Fantasian does, and Final Fantasy IX is super easy. But there's nothing cheap about Fantasian.
Mhm.
I think that like it is his epic in terms of encounter design, which I think is something that is sort of slept on for Sakaguchi, that he understood encounter design in a
Hmm.
really important way.
About Fantasian, I'm looking forward to playing it sometime in the near future, but the thing that it was sold on like years ago on the Apple Arcade was the like diorama settings, like the built-in overview of the world. But even more so for me, Nobuo Uematsu, like he came back to work with Sakaguchi on the soundtrack, and he's been quoted as saying like every Final Fantasy soundtrack of like the 100 plus tracks, he'll pick out like two or three songs that he actually feels proud of. And according to him, like Fantasian, he feels proud about like the whole thing. Like he feels like he's really letting himself go wild on the soundtrack. So I am really excited to like, hear and see it all together wrapped up. I mean, that could just be Uematsu trying to push, the marketing for
Yeah, I
Fantasia. But yeah,
yeah,
it looks
I
looks
mean,
great.
I will say that I didn't think the Uematsu soundtrack was incredible,
Okay.
but yes, I mean, good for him.
Yeah, I mean, like Uematsu has been the composer on all four of these Miss Walker games we've discussed, but for the record, like he's still like bringing it, but none of these soundtracks match like the top Final Fantasy soundtracks. Like they just don't.
Yeah. Okay, so we are at the end of the Sakaguchi catalog. This has been a long one, y'all. I appreciate both of you for sticking with us for so long, and I appreciate listeners for listening to us talk about Sakaguchi for so long. This has gone on for longer than I intended, but like there's so much to talk about with
Oh,
Sakaguchi, and I
one
don't think
one
we
last
spent.
thing, Zach. Is it
Go
okay
ahead.
to briefly talk about like, do we feel a difference between like post FF10 and pre FF10, like post Sakaguchi?
Sure.
Is there a notable
I,
difference in like the
I
Final
actually think
Fantasy
that's a good
identity?
way for us to sort of end our conversation,
Mm,
is to talk about how we sort of see the differences, because as much as Sakaguchi has spent more than half his career outside of Final Fantasy, let's be honest, that's where his career is defined, right? So like, yeah, that's a good question. Like, do we see the difference between like sort of what he did 1 through 9 and what we've seen 10 through 16?
I mean, one thing like I've noticed, let's say like from Final Fantasy 13 onward, the amount of character development, and not like story wise, but like equipment wise, magic wise, level wise, systems wise, is it's a little less RPG-ish in that way. And I'm not here to bash Final Fantasy 16, but I mean it's kind of less of an RPG than God of War Ragnarok. But I mean, like there is less of a sorry, I got a cough in my throat. Uh, yeah, there is less of an emphasis on like building your party in that way, and even the party system. Like the party has gotten smaller. Like FF15, you have four characters that aren't interchangeable with other party members. You can't swap them out. FF16 even less so. So I do think maybe like the traditional party has changed as we know it in Final Fantasy. And you look at other things like let's say Persona or Dragon Quest, like they have kept the the swappable party members, and like there's more equipment versatility in those games, I think. But I don't say that as a bad thing. I think Final Fantasy is like by far the most cinematic of RPG series, even more so recently. But yeah, maybe the party system has changed a lot.
Yeah, I mean, like the way, like we brought it up earlier that like if Final Fantasy has an identity, it's to constantly be reinventing itself. And after Final Fantasy 9, like the series has had to do that, like in a more literal sense with who's actually developing the game. Like
Yeah.
every game
Mm,
has had like a different director, often different character designers, although Nomura is still the main character designer of the series. Um, Still like appearing on the most titles at least. Um, and different composers. Like these are just like the series is just constantly being reinvented by different creatives at Square with different ideas, different priorities, while also trying to weave in references both narratively and game design wise from those earlier titles. But I think one thing that like the series is continuing to do is just maintain that sense of cinematicness in terms of like how it presents everything, how it's trying to reinvent itself. A strong focus on like well written, nuanced characters. All these elements that we've sort of been celebrating throughout this episode appear in these later Final Fantasies just in highly new and uh, unusual and unexpected ways. But despite me having different preferences between everything that came out after 9, um, like I respect every one of these games in their own right. I
mm,
think they all have interesting ideas. They're trying to push the medium forward in technological or design ways or storytelling. And I'm always still amped for any new Final Fantasy game that comes out.
definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. Like, certainly, I think that One of the things that I think is interesting is like like again, there's a feature on the site that's literally like the idea of Final Fantasy is reinvention, but
Mm,
I don't necessarily think that was the idea under Sakaguchi. I think the idea was like it was about pushing boundaries within the bounds of what we're already doing. Um, so like you think about like 5 to 6, 6 to 7, like 6 to 7 is maybe the biggest jump, but like they're not these enormous reinventions, and there are still like a lot of pieces of the previous game in the next game always
Mm.
in the
mm,
first 9. Whereas now I don't think that's true at all. Like despite the fact that 15 and 16 are both action RPGs, they play extraordinarily differently.
mm.
Like there is almost no DNA that is similar between the two of them. Like I can't think of actually anything. I'm sure there's something. Please, listener, tell me. But that is similar between 15 and 16.
A
Nothing.
handsome protagonist with dark hair.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. They are just like totally different types of games. But like to me, like they're still fundamentally Final Fantasy. Like they still have Final Fantasy elements. They're still doing Final Fantasy things. And while I might personally strongly prefer one of those games to the other, um,
Now it's my turn to cough.
they exactly, exactly. They still, to me, still maintain the spirit of the series,
Mm,
and so I don't think Sakaguchi leaving determined what the spirit of the series was. I think that every game I've played since then, and I haven't played 11, and I've played very little of 13, but like every game of the series since then still feels like Final Fantasy to me. I think that we've lost the through line to some degree, but we have kept the reinvention.
yeah, I mean, like we said in the beginning, like the whole point of Final Fantasy, like it originated as a big swing to save the company, and they've been like, even though they're much better off now, they've been swinging ever since. Like each game is a big swing, and like sometimes it connects less so, but like it's still, yeah, like high bar of quality all through, definitely.
If we're talking about like sort of the the overall what is Final Fantasy, which is always how these conversations always end, that probably means that our conversation is at an end. But I want to thank both of you so much for coming on for me for what is an even longer episode than the listeners know, because there have been multiple bathroom breaks here to talk about Sakaguchi. Like his oeuvre is so large, it's so important, it's so significant to the genre as a whole, and both of you just came like you came ready to go, and I really appreciate both of you. Aleks, as always, and Matt, as your first time, this is like gotta be like the Rookie of the Year award for best first appearance on a
Well done,
podcast or
Matt.
RPG fan.
Woohoo!
You
Yay
you are
me!
phenomenal.
It's so surreal, you guys.
Just
I've you've been in my ear for like hundreds of hours, and to be like I'm talking to Zach and Al. It's really weird for me. It's really weird.
You've been phenomenal. I mean that sincerely. So yeah, thank you, listeners, for sticking with us so long. But speaking of that, I should move on to housekeeping so we can wrap this up, and you guys can all get back to your days, including you listeners. So let's talk about what's coming up. So coming up in 2 weeks is the first episode on Tales of Grace's F. It's one of the multiple Tales games that we've done on RPG Fans Retro Encounter. It's my first time through it. I've played like 6 hours of it at this point, and my wife is hard carrying me through it because this game is like hard. I'm getting bodied by like individual enemies in Tales of Grace's F. People say like it's the best combat system, and that's probably true, but that also means it's the hardest one. So I'm enjoying my time with it, and we will talk about that in a couple of weeks. There might be the return of someone very important to many of our listeners on that episode, so tune in. I can say that like the next episode after that, of course, will also be about Tales of Grace's F, the second half of that, and then I have a lot of episodes planned out after that. But the only one I'm going to say for sure right now, and I know both of you panelists are on this episode, is we are going to have a BioWare fantasy draft.
Oh,
Again, one of the most
Canada.
common threads and themes in my inbox nowadays is like draft episodes. We love them, so I'm like, let's do a BioWare one. And I'm not qualified to lead that episode at all, so I won't be hosting it, but it is coming soon, soonish, at least in a couple months. And we have a lot of other things planned, but I'll wait to tell you guys about that until a couple weeks from now. If you want to email us, you can email us retro@rpgfan.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, The Bad Place, Blue Sky, Twitch, YouTube. We're usually RPG Fan or RPG Fancom. on most of those places. You can also talk to us on Discord. I am on there as well. We also have 2 different shops. One is TeePublic, where you can buy like t-shirts and mugs and things like that. And the other is Hyperplay RPG, where you can buy the RPG Fan Review Card book, which has 300 books, or 300 pages, I'm sorry, of reviews in the card form that you might have seen on Instagram. They're beautiful. Steph originally designed them, and there are a lot of different things to see there. It's kind of like an old video game magazine, and it's really fun. We also have 2 other fine podcasts. Random Encounter, which it posts every other Monday, usually about current events, current video games, what we're playing now, what we're reviewing now, what's current. Then we also have Rhythm Encounter, which posts the other Monday of those other 2 Mondays, and it is about RPG music. You can also review us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify. If there are podcasts there, we are there. We love feedback. And let's talk about where we can find the individual panelists, starting with you, Aleks.
You can just email me at alexfraniczek@gmail.com.
And Matt.
If you like mediocre science fiction like The Spirits Within, I have 2 sci-fi short story collections on my website, mattwardellwrites.wordpress.com. Same thing for Instagram. Yeah, please check it out. And I'm also an RPG fan now.
I guarantee they are better than Spirit. I haven't read them, but it's awesome. And if you would get in touch with me, honestly, the thing I check most often is retro@rpgfan.com. But you can also find me on Discord as Zach W. And I want to thank the 2 of you again for what was an idea that I was honestly nervous about. I knew there was a lot to cover here, and you both were just excellent. So many ideas, so many good things that you guys talked about. And I also want to thank you, listeners. Good night and good luck.